Oh my. I'm not quite sure I'm going to follow up either of those starting points. Let's see what we've got though. You know, for those of you who've been around for a while, you may recollect we've actually been working on this identity stuff now for 30 years at least. 30 years. We've been trying to engage in a way that would improve the capabilities of identity systems over that entire time. And one of my reflections would be, looking back, that we've been through these multiple waves that have occurred over that time. Some of them corresponding, some of them, so some troughs in the middle, some of them overlapping each other. But in almost every wave, we have tried to address the same values, the same concerns, the same approaches every single time, and keep iterating around these. And I have to say at the moment, one of the most exciting things to me is that this is in fact one of the most exciting times that we have in the identity community. This is an incredible time to actually be innovating and engaging in the whole set of challenges and problems that we have in the digital identity world, particularly as it relates to consumers. So I figured we might actually take a look at some of the iterations that we've done here, just to give you a sense of what's going on. So for a lot of this actually kicks all the way back to the RSA public key algorithm. I worked at RSA, so this is kind of near and dear to my heart. Back at the time that we were engaging with the RSA algorithm, it was considered so dangerous that it was actually protected in the same way from an export perspective like Stinger missiles. If you exported your crypto, you could be arrested and dragged off to prison. And we were doing battle with the NSA around the Clipper chip, which is trying to provide backdoors into our cryptography. One of our first major privacy challenges, and in this particular case, it was the US government that was the primary set of folks that wanted to eliminate our privacy opportunities. Around this time, X509 was in fact one of the first of our attempts at a technology-based governance system. How do you actually make this technology work in some reasonable fashion? And along with that, we of course had alternate systems. Pretty good privacy turned up. PGP was in fact a different way to handle public keys, and it was fundamentally our first attempt at, let's have everybody own their own identity. You created your own public key pair, you got to tell other people who you were, and as a result of that, you effectively established your identity in this growing, burgeoning network for PGP. And this, in fact, points up one of the most interesting challenges we're going to revisit a couple of times today, which is, in that pure technology solution, we turned up with a challenge that became known as the PGP Web of Trust problem. The PGP Web of Trust problem said, the further you get away from me, the more people that are involved in the process, the more likely we are to have collusion, we have more problems dealing with recognizing fraud, and how do we deal with that? Turns out, 30 years later, we still actually haven't managed to solve that from a pure technology solution. We then moved on to delivering large-scale identity systems in various ways. For those of you who are around, Identiverse was in fact the first multi-bank opportunity to build identities out across a large ecosystem. The goal was to reduce the costs of knowing who your customer was. Something that sounds pretty familiar right at the moment. Gartner was telling us this was the year of the smart card. Smart cards, those trusted execution environments where you got to store your keys and own them as an individual device, which protected your identity and formed the basis of a lot of our trust models. No, mobile phones weren't the first ones to do this. Interestingly enough though, whereas mobile phones you can substitute multiple fingerprints as a shared device, smart cards was a little harder, so there may have been a couple of characteristics that were interesting there. At RSA, where I was at that time, we were producing a set of distributed virtual attribute stores known as key-on wallets. So we were in the process of creating active clients that allowed us to share attributes in various ways. And of course, from Gartner's perspective, this was also the year of PKI. Any of you who are old enough to remember this will remember the enormous amount of excitement, enthusiasm. The world was like about to be totally transformed and changed. There was vast amounts of money invested. We had huge companies like IBM, Microsoft, Sun, the list went on, that were involved in the whole of the public key infrastructure engagement. And it turned out it didn't make a difference. So the fact that we had large companies involved in an engagement, for me these days is much less of a convincing argument than are we actually making progress in some form. So the interesting thing about this whole public key infrastructure thing is that not long after this process, or this part of the engagement, we hit a major trough. After all that investment, after all the engagement, public key infrastructure effectively vaporized within about 12 months. PKI companies imploded or were sold off. And the reason fundamentally was that we didn't work out how to deliver the promises of PKI in an effectively short time period which met the expectations that we'd set. In addition to which, we had a whole bunch of expectations about what are the value propositions that we are going to define. Expectations like everyone would have a certificate because everyone had to sign documents turned out to be completely fallacious. We only ever sold a couple of certificates per enterprise in order to do with enterprise signatures. Our expectations were just plain wrong. At about this time, we had the next wave kind of overlapping with some of this. This is where Microsoft turned up and basically said, hey, if you use Hailstorm and Passport, just use my solution everywhere, and it will all just work for you. And by the way, I'll take care of your identities for you. Don't you worry about that. Not surprisingly, there was a bit of reaction to this, which is in fact the Liberty Alliance. This is where we got federated identity. This is where the SAML protocol turned up. Along the way, we also designed the WS star set of standards. Sadly, I have a certain amount of responsibility for that. Totally regret it, just to be clear. We all make mistakes. This is an example, however, of large and complex architectures that you spend a vast amount of time and effort on with huge backing from major companies that never go anywhere. It's kind of distracting, like, honestly, it's disappointing at some levels. Like, man, what on earth did you do with your career other than, like, do things that failed? The next period, in many respects, was, for want of a better term, what I might refer to as the renaissance of the consumer identity space. So Kim Cameron was off building the 7 laws of identity along with a bunch of other folks. Identity 2.0 turned up in the context of the Web 2.0 O'Reilly engagement. Descartes, you can still find his presentation, delivered about 600 slides in 30 seconds to tell us all about how your attributes could be more effectively used. Dick, wherever you are, great job. We were building out information cards. What were information cards? Effectively active clients. Similar to what we were doing with Keon and the RSA environment, information cards, again, allowed us a mechanism to store and share attributes in hopefully an effective fashion. OpenID was just kicking off. Back again to everybody should own their own identity. The whole origin for OpenID was not to give you easier ways to do federation in your enterprises. It was fundamentally, how do you each own your own identity? And that was our starting point for OpenID. About that time, I was involved at PayPal. I produced one of the first commercial OpenID providers that time. We were building out concepts like identity personas, and by the way, they will not get you anywhere near as far as you think they're going to get you if you're still playing with them, and identity wallets, so that we had no shortage of identity wallets and active clients turning up. That moved us on to a phase where we began dealing with identity at national scale. Citizen trust frameworks, UK Verify, NSTIC, New Zealand government, a whole range of these, including the Canadian version of this, which is now an outcome of a lot of those original constructs. We were busily building those out. We'd started working on attribute exchanges, which allowed us to take information that was verified, claims about users, and share them. think I built 3 of these, or at least tried to build 3 of them at about this period of time. And we were happily engaged in a whole range of pretty interesting potentials at this point. Which kind of brings us up to today, and there's going to be endless number of presentations on current technology, so I'm not going to bore you to death with that at this point. But I think there's an interesting question here, which is every time I look at what's happened over this time, we are back yet again dealing with old challenges with new technologies. What am I doing in the midst of all this? Well, turns out that I like solving pragmatic problems. So capital One is being dragged along with me on this. We are looking to provide mechanisms that allow you to reduce the complexity of your verification methods. This is an example of one of the use cases we've been developing with ADP. If you sign up as a payroll participant who wants to engage to manage your payroll processing, then in order to know who you are, you normally have to go through a huge and complex set of verification processes, generally based around knowledge-based authentication in some form. The alternative that we've been working with them on is, hey, if you're a Capital One customer, if you sign in, we'll provide verified information about you using consumer consent in order to dramatically reduce and simplify exactly what the process looks like. So this one I kind of like. Lots of us have this challenge and this opportunity. The next set of things that we're doing is fundamentally this. We have a requirement in order to effectively identify who our customers are for all kinds of regulatory and other reasons. We have risk processes, we have security, we spend vast amounts of money on actually making sure we know who you are and ensuring that you're not subverted in some way. Effectively, what we're doing is taking those same processes and we are commercializing them, we're exporting them, we're making them available to third parties so they can actually use the same thing. We're working with ADP. This is not actually a real thing at the moment. We're just in an investigation phase with them on this particular set of capabilities. But this is effectively taking a government ID, like a driver's license, and then scanning it. Sitting in the back end, however, are all of the mobile operator checks, the device verifications, the risk evaluation processes, the machine learning, the AI, everything that goes into making sure that we know what your identity is. But again, the concept here and all of the things we're trying to do is, hey, if we could deliver the right piece of information at the right time, assuming user consent, then we have this opportunity to enable new digital experiences that we haven't seen previously. One of the privileges I had when I was working at RSA was that I worked with public keys and public key infrastructure. I know it's out of date, you all think it's boring, but it was fun at the time. The thing I got to do that was different than the rest of the company is that everybody else had to deal with security issues. How do you stop bad things happening? And I had the joy of every single day talking to customers about, if you implement this identity stuff, here are the new set of things you've never been able to do before that you could be enabled to handle right now. So it was an enormously exciting time. It also allowed me to establish some fundamental beliefs. So just to put it on the record, I believe thoroughly and entirely that we need identity systems that are designed for people, not corporations, where those people have insight and control over how their information is used. And even if we don't have that full control now, my grandkids might have a chance to do that more effectively if we can build out those correct systems. So at PayPal, this was the way that I wanted my users to engage with us and to see how we respected their rights as PayPal consumers. That is that if I was a PayPal user, it should be my information, it should be on my device, and it should be under my control. So none of this is new. Invariably across the waves of technology that we've seen, there is this fundamental concept that I generally refer to as the kickoff meeting. And I've been in so many of these, it's terrifying. In fact, I was in one about 3 months ago, and every single one of them is exactly the same across 30 years. Within that kickoff meeting, we had a bunch of really insightful people, all of whom engaged to get this new identity technology, whatever it was, might have been information cards, and we all had this set of beliefs, all of which I totally believe in, by the way, which is, A, we're going to build a better world for consumers, we were going to engage with user consent and control, we were going to build a system that was more effective at safer information sharing and limited how much information would be shared, and we were fundamentally going to reduce costs for service providers that were going to utilize this. We would have a trust framework which would pull it all together and give us a sense of governance and control over this, and invariably, for 30 years now, the use cases we talked about were age verification, reducing the cost of knowing your customer, and potentially verified information delivery as an enabler. So 30 years it's been the same meeting. Like, I'd really like to move on from this at this point. And somehow in the middle of it, everybody was going to make ridiculous amounts of money, which was always interesting. Nobody quite called out what that was. At some point after 30 years, you kind of have to ask this question. Maybe it's us. Maybe it's we, the technologists, that are actually the fatal flaw. We keep seeming to reproduce a whole range of engagements that, in many respects, end up in very similar outcomes. Amazing technology. Frankly, none of the technology that we've produced was bad. Well, except for XML and SOAP. They were definitely bad. Relying on a technology as a systemic answer is kind of a fundamental for us as technologists. Of course we can build it. We have crypto. Believe me, I know, I've been there. Happy paths are really easy in any of these systems. Anyone can show a registration and an authentication process that will knock your socks off. You come to dealing with account recovery, or how do you put somebody back in control of their information, or how do you deal with complex trust environments, or how do you handle the fact that I actually have multiple trusted devices, and so I can't rely on a key store that's operating just in one of them. I have to be me across multiple of them. And all of a sudden, the world becomes much more interesting. You know, the most disappointing thing in 30 years is, despite all of our technology, we have utterly failed to deliver a convincing user experience at scale. Not once have I ever seen us deliver anything that looked like mere mortals could use our amazing technology systems. We kind of need to do something about that, folks. Our governance models almost invariably operate at a technology level. They don't deal with issues like fraud, or if bad actors occur, how do you deal with them, find them, get people's information restored in some reasonable way. After 25 plus years, we are again reiterating on the same set of technologies, problems, and challenges. And my biggest concern, while I'm enormously excited about the huge opportunity that we have before us right at this time, is that our technology solutions are now orders of magnitude more complex than they have ever been before. That's not a good sign. So in the midst of all this, we're still dealing with the PGP Web of Trust problem in all of the contexts of the technology that we're currently engaging with. There's a challenge here. So let me tell you about what it looked like at OpenID when we first began to engage on that. So ignoring PKI for a moment, OpenID, remember, everyone is going to have their own identity. We were going to have this amazing opportunity to share information in an Identity 2.0 framework. And the conversation when I walked into it said basically this: we will have hundreds of millions of consumers that all own their identities and information who will interact with hundreds of thousands of service providers. What an amazing system. And you say, well, wait, where did we get those hundreds of millions of consumers? And it's like, you don't understand. We have hundreds of thousands of service providers, all of whom are going to be leveraging this information and giving you new services. Well, wow, where did we get the hundreds of millions of consumers from? Well, the whole argument actually ended up being circular, as it turned out. So what I came to understand was, in almost all of our conversations about identity, we can't help ourselves. We always talk about what I call the steady state of the identity universe. That is, in 10 years from now, when all this is set up and running effectively, we can't help but be successful and make money. Here's the problem. We're actually about a billionth of a second after the Big Bang. We aren't in the steady state of the universe at all. The laws of the physical universe are actually different right at the moment. And the really big challenge is, how do we actually get from the Big Bang into that steady state? The only thing that really matters in this kind of a phase is how do you effectively bootstrap our environment? And we've actually managed to fail significantly every time we've tried to do this. It's not actually meant to be a downer in terms of their identity community, but honestly, we have been around the loop a few times here. We had relying parties at every single phase. Everybody was enthusiastic, bought in, yes, we want to do this stuff. And then you looked around after a while and that all kind of vaporized. Nobody stayed the distance. Interesting question. So what was going on? We may have discovered a few things along the way. Here's the first one, and this really bites as a technologist. Consumer trust actually has nothing to do with our promises about security and technology. It has everything to do with brand. If you have a trusted brand, you have a really interesting starting point. Totally unfair, completely unreasonable. Yes, I know you all want to argue with that, but as it turns out, it is in fact one of the more significant opportunities we have to work out how to bootstrap this system that we're building right at the moment. And closely tied to that is this coverage problem. All right, well, if I walk up to a service provider and say, hey, I've got this great opportunity to change the way that your information is stored, you will no longer have issues with breaches because the information won't be stored in your system. The challenge is I only represent 1% of your consumers. The reason relying parties or service providers don't stick around is we can't actually bring enough consumers to their door quickly enough to actually make a difference. So we run out of energy in the midst of all of this, and then the relying parties are gone, we have a problem. From the consumer, the opposite side of the coverage problem is this. If I only turn up at 1 in 10 places who can take my identity and utilize it, consumers get bored really, really quickly. They're a very slippery bunch. It's really hard to actually get them to engage on this. Here's the last thing that totally bummed me out in the various startups that I tried to build in the identity space. It is impossible, as far as I can tell, to start from 0 consumers and build a ramp fast enough that will ever satisfy your VCs. It's exactly the problem we run into with public key infrastructure. What happened with OpenID? Well, it had to become an enterprise solution. Every time you look at this, there is this ongoing challenge about how do you actually build enough consumer and service provider engagement to make this effective? And by the way, you have to loosely couple the two of those because you can't do them both at once, as it turns out. So, where are we at the moment? We kind of have 2 fundamental models that we're playing with in various forms for our current engagement for consumer identity. The first one is kind of classic. We have a consumer who relates to an identity provider. There is some path to a set of service providers or relying parties. There might even be a network in the middle that is helping facilitate that. There will be a set of claims and identity attributes stored somewhere, and that will generally be drawn from the identity provider and some other set of attribute providers. So that's model 1. Model 2 looks kind of like this generically. You can argue about details, but most of them fit this. This is where a consumer has to interact with a relying party. Again, there may actually be an identity network in the middle that helps deal with some of the problems of how do you get enough service providers on board. There will almost always be an active client of some sort where identity attributes and claims are stored, again, fed by identity providers and some other set of attribute providers. I build out any number of systems like this. The RSA key-on wallets look like this. Information cards look like this. We've done this innumerable times. Active clients are really interesting. They have fantastic properties from a privacy perspective, particularly as it relates to not tracking who you are. But here's the challenge. It turns out that if, in fact, one of the major opportunities for us is to leverage trusted brands to help bootstrap this environment, because remember, we haven't done very well at this so far, the challenge is this. And by the way, both these models have pros and cons. I'm not arguing for one or the other. I'm merely identifying some challenges that I think we need to deal with. In the first model, what happens is if you bring a trusted brand in with a set of very expensive, highly verified, highly trusted identities to deal with engagements where assurance really matters, then in the first model, there's kind of this natural engagement which says, hey, the identity provider gets to continue their relationship with their consumers. In all of these models, the part of the challenge, or one of the reasons why these trusted identity providers are useful, is they have a direct-to-consumer relationship. Now, I have a whole other presentation about what does it look like when you have to pitch identity systems to executives when you want to build one of these. But I ran into this at PayPal. It's like, well, wait a minute. Why would we take our PayPal identities, put the brand at risk, given that it's going to take 5 years to see a payoff? How do I explain that as the CEO to the board? These are very real questions. In this model, you kind of argue that, well, actually, the set of interactions with your consumers, you actually continue to build those in some interesting way by providing additional value. What happens in the second model? And I think this is one of the challenges we need to work out how to address in some meaningful fashion. In this model, the identity provider provides a bunch of verified claims and attributes. They get stored in an active client. And then, by definition, in most models, you never call home. So the relationship that you've just spent a huge amount of time investing in gets broken effectively, or at least downplayed, because in the second model, there is no way for the expensive identities that you've convinced them to insert to actually be continuously built out. And so disintermediation takes place. This is a big problem. Again, there are great values in the second model. The challenge for us is, how do we convince these people that we need to bootstrap this, that there's a model here that allows them to move forward in order to be effective? Right, so I'm very much into building out pragmatic solutions as often as we can. Delivering stuff fast and learning from it is really important to me. I got to suffer through OSI networking. I got to suffer through token ring, token bus, major operating system architectures, X500, X400, and the list goes on. Every single one of them was supported by large companies. Everybody thought it was a great example of how to move forward, but invariably, each of those huge investments in architecture and technology failed us because we never actually managed to deliver anything fast enough before the next wave of technology overtook us. So what are the building blocks that are interesting starting points? I like verified claims. Verified claims represent to me a really interesting starting point where we can share information in a consistent way. I really do like active clients. We need to solve the bootstrapping problem, but I think they are pretty interesting engagements. Decentralized identities, I'm still trying to work out whether it adds value to active clients or not. There's kind of a bit of a debate there about, is that actually really useful? And then I need claims distribution and verification networks, which, by the way, we've done a really poor job of defining right at the moment. We have verified claims, but it's really hard to do anything other than cryptographic verification of signatures on them. The other kinds of issues related to trust are kind of a bigger problem in this space. I also need trusted brands who can engage, generally in partnerships, to help deliver both direct-to-consumer relationships that consumers will trust and engage with, and I need a pretty large collection of relying parties in order to be effective at rolling out the system. We just finished an engagement with Forrester where we did a bunch of research into the question of what are the brands that consumers might trust to actually deal with a high value or highly assured transaction. Not surprisingly, financial institutions were way ahead. Financial institutions already manage our money. We kind of feel that if you did that okay, maybe you might make the next kind of level. No, you probably won't use those identities on the dark web, but that's okay. We're mostly interested in how do we create new opportunities for consumers that are interesting in the high assurance space. And the thing that turns out to be interesting about financial institutions is that, and I'm kind of surprised at this, We are, without doubt, the most highly regulated group anywhere. On a regular basis, I deal with multiple collections of regulators. They care very deeply and audit and inspect what I do with my consumers' data and have done for a long time. And if I screw up, bad things are going to happen, both from a brand and also from a financial position. This is highly motivating, let me tell you, for actually doing a good job with how do we protect consumer information. Now, things screw up, I get that. On the other hand, what's interesting is when they screw up, it turns out we generally find out about them. The challenge in our governance models that are primarily oriented around technical trust is that recovery is a really interesting problem. How do we deal with fraud? How do we deal with the fact that collusion is taking place, that there are bad folks that are actually trying to subvert the system? How do we get things back running again when it all goes wrong? We have this huge gap between the levels of technology governance and what is real governance around helping people to be in control of their information and their systems. The reason I poke at this is that I think there's a really interesting opportunity here for us, which is if we, for a moment, could step back from a viewpoint that said we must have a pure technology solution and said there turn out to be some kinds of trusted entities. Mobile operators, there are various others that you might want to argue about in this space. But if we were to leverage those, then the complexity level of our architectures, as it turns out, drops out dramatically. That I'm really excited about, because this is a time I don't want to waste. Partly because I'm getting too old, I may not have too many more of these around. I don't want to waste this one. I really want us to be successful about making the world more effective for our consumers, how their information gets used and how it gets protected. And so I don't want to spend 10 years building out architectures only to find out we fail yet again. I want to move right now and not miss this opportunity that we have. So, just so you have a sense of where we are, at Capital One, I have to solve identity verification for my consumers. We're taking those same solutions, we're bringing them to market, we'd like to share them with you. We think we can actually add some value for you, particularly around cost reduction and having a higher level of confidence about both the fraud and other characteristics of your users. And mostly I'm interested in building a pragmatic and simplified identity information system, systems that actually change the lives of people for good. That's my starting point. We are looking for folks to join with us, to partner with us, to help work out how to deal with some of this, particularly around identity verification and information. We'd really like to talk to you if you'd like to join us on some of those. Thank you.